Hello, good morning and good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. We thank you for taking a few moments out of your day to join us for today's presentation of how to build your new MarTech stack. My name is Scott Dill. I'm on the business development team here with Real Story Group, and our company founder, Tony Byrne, is going to join us momentarily to walk us through the heart of today's presentation. But before we get started, I did want to go through a couple of quick housekeeping items. First and foremost, if you have questions throughout the presentation, you can enter those into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll either get to those during the session or right at the very end. So we certainly encourage you to stick around at the end for any questions that you might have. Excuse me. The other item I wanted to mention is that you'll all be receiving a copy of these slides within the next couple days. And then for our subscribers on the line, you'll also be able to access a recording of today's presentation in your subscriber library. I do see a lot of new faces here, or a lot of new names, I should say, and to those, welcome. If you're new to Real Story Group, we're an analyst firm. We've been around for the past 17 years, but we've taken a different approach to the way we evaluate the vendors that we cover in the digital workplace and digital marketing areas, in that we don't do any work for those vendors, or we don't advise them on their strategy or speak at their conferences, sort of quid pro quo. The way we approach it is we're going to talk about what they do well, but perhaps more importantly, where they could potentially fall short for you. We don't rank them on who's the best or who's the worst, but rather what's going to be the right fit for what it is you're trying to do. And the model we take with our customers is we offer subscriptions to one or multiple research areas. We also do advisory hours as part of those subscriptions. And for a select number of customers, we'll even come on site as part of a broader consulting engagement where we help you with the technology selection or with a strategic roadmap as you look to plan for future investments. The areas we cover within our research fall under two major buckets, which are digital workplace and digital marketing technology, which you'll see on the map. The digital workplace area is in the bottom half, while as digital marketing is at the top half, and that's going to be the focus of today's presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Tony Byrne. Tony?
Great, thanks, Scott. As you mentioned, we've been around for 17 years, and I like to just tell a little bit of story about how I founded what was the predecessor to Real Story Group. It was a little company called CMS Watch, and we were implementing some WCM and search and other digital marketing technologies, and really frustrated sometimes with some of the tools we were using. And then I discovered through our clients who were working with it, many times they had picked them because they were in the top right-hand corner of some sort of quadrant. They were basically building their stack through somebody else's matrix about which were the best vendors and which were the worst. And I thought this was a crazy way to do it. And in fact, in many cases led to a lot of negative outcomes. And I thought that there had to be a better way of telling the real story about what was going to be the right fit for you. Like, not necessarily what's the best vendor that's out there, but what's the right fit for you. And we figured out pretty quickly that that meant really doing much more customer-centric, deep dive evaluations of these vendors and their technologies. And that's what we do for a living. And as Scott mentioned, you can subscribe to that research at any time. But along the way, of course, we have to understand, how do these pieces fit together? And in the case of digital marketing, I think we're all understanding now that this is a growing stack of technologies. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, which is what's the right way to build that stack. And in particular, to think about what we are seeing as kind of some new models for these stacks. So the agenda today is going to be a pretty rapid-paced conversation, but we're going to talk first about 3 ways to visualize your stack. I'm sure that one or more of them you'll find useful in taking back to your own colleagues. And then what are some lessons that we can learn from this in terms of building the stack? And then finally, always very important to understand what's the right way to select new tools as you build your stack going forward. Okay, so here's one way to visualize your stack, and this is a fairly traditional enterprise architecture diagram. Some people call this pejoratively a layer cake diagram. I'm sure you all recognize it. starts out with a data layer on the bottom, which could be BI, analytics, ERP, product information management, and so on and so forth. Then you have this multicolored content and engagement management layer, obviously very important to manage images, to manage web and digital content, to do outbound marketing, social engagement, all those sorts of things. Then you have this production, interaction, delivery services, could be portals, could be communities, could be mobile middleware, CDNs, online video platforms. There's any number of different conduits here that you're pushing things out through all of these different channels, right? And we all have a lot of different channels that we're doing things through. Even website itself can, of course, be a static marketing website or any number of different interactive applications where you're engaging your customers. So as a reference model, we often use it to help our subscribers do a strong inventory. A lot of usefulness to this. It gives you the big picture. You can build these things into idealized to be and then compare them with as is. If you can put this on a single slide like this, it gives you a joint understanding and allows you to do some discussion and analysis. Also, it's layered, right? So this is why, even though we call it a layer cake kind of pejoratively, it is useful to think about these things in terms of layers, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But clearly one of the things you can do with this, and we've certainly done this with our own subscribers, is to customize it for your unique environment. So what you have on the left is an advocacy organization, and they send out millions of emails every day to mobilize their membership. And so you can imagine that the marketing automation platform is the center of their stack, and it's something that everything else revolves around. WCM and social engagement are still important for them, but it's marketing automation where they really need to invest their key resources and where they really realize that they needed to build up their human resources as well, not just their technical capabilities. Whereas on the right, you see a major consumer goods company, and their stack is a little bit different. What's really driving them now increasingly is visual storytelling. And so the digital asset management system is really the center of their marketing stack, and it's the one that kind of drives everything else that they're building their other tools around. So, you can use these sort of layered diagrams to have an internal conversation, whether it's as is or to be, around what do we have, and also what's more important, what are the drivers as opposed to the passengers, as it were, in our stack. So it's a useful way of doing a reference model. One key takeaway that's been so fascinating to observe and actively participate in with our subscribers over the last couple of years is this notion of decision making moving lower in the stack. So this is a little bit of enterprise architecture. Bear with me for a minute here. At the high level, you have these different application services. We saw those before: CRM, email marketing, web content and experience management, social marketing, and any number of future services down the road, right? Many of these, unfortunately, have become quite siloed, right? And this is part of the problem with doing omni-channel engagement. And I think the enterprise architecture answer to this problem is to move more capabilities lower in the stack so all of your different channels can participate and take advantage of that. So obviously one is campaign and orchestration, personalization, certainly analytics, reporting, visualization. This is an area where I think we've all gotten better about kind of separating that from some of our engagement systems. Customer data platform, very hot. We're going to be coming out next month with our evaluations of 20 CDP vendors, particularly if you're a B2C company. This is a piece of your architecture you want to consider very seriously. And this other thing that we're calling a content marketing warehouse. So this is kind of a pre-processing of your content and pre-development of your content before it goes out to all these different streams. Really interesting things happening in this space, at least organizationally, not so much on the vendor side, unfortunately. And then, of course, identity and access management are really critical for all this. And so as you build your stack, some of this stuff that's enterprise-wide isn't always sexy. You can't immediately always come up with the ROI, but we're beginning to see, particularly larger enterprises, really seeing the payoff of investing kind of a little bit lower in the stack and removing some capabilities from some of these silos that really don't belong there anymore. One of the interesting side benefits of this is that very often in terms of these application services, once you remove things like data and orchestration and so forth, then you can often get away with simpler tools. And all of the things being equal, simpler, my friends, is better. There's another way of visualizing your stack, and it's interesting. We kind of did this originally for fun, and it turns out it really had legs. And this is kind of turning the stack on its side and sort of looking at it in terms of a MarTech mall. So rather than layers here, we have anchor stores and boutiques. The idea is that, you know, your mall may look very different from this, but there's probably 4 or 5 systems that are really important for you. You've got to pay a lot of attention to, that you're likely going to license more as like a single tenant platform, even if you're running it in the cloud. But then you have all these other boutique capabilities that you may or may not need. And those are areas where you can experiment. If the boutique goes under, the whole mall's not coming down. And it's an area where maybe you can do more experimentation, more multi-tenant software as a service, that sort of thing. So this notion of having anchor stores then gives you the sense for, you know, what do we really need to be prioritizing and what's truly important and mission critical for us. And then, like I say, tenancy, you know, where can we go single tenant as opposed to multi-tenant. And this whole notion of two-speed MarTech, right? That in some of our larger anchor stores, we're going to maybe be a little bit more careful and deliberative about how we do DevOps and other sorts of things. This model also allows you to group tool sets logically, so that sometimes is useful as well. And so the issue with this is obviously a very useful way, and we've had some wonderful exercises from our subscribers helping them kind of describe what their MarTech model looks like, either as is or to be. There's a big drawback to both of these models here, and I'm going to invite you in the comments section to tell me what that drawback is. There's something missing both in the layer cake diagram and in the mall diagram, something important that's missing. So I'll invite you in the GoToWebinar control panel in the comments section to just opine what big thing is missing. And Jonathan, I will get to your question a little bit later about B2B diagrams, but I just invite you to just type into the questions tab, what is missing? So one is the thing that glues it all together. So that's a great, possibility, certainly, Craig. And some might argue that it's data and identity management. Human resources, skill sets, clearly, right? These are not necessarily organizational models. We'll talk about that in a second. So Megan, that's a good answer as well. Right, and so Jill has chimed in here. The missing piece is the customer. That's right. The customer is not in either of these diagrams. So we offer you a third kind of reference model where we have the customer at the center, right, of your stack. And your stack is not so much a square, but more of a circle. It's a little bit more expansive. And so your customer and your customer needs are at the middle. There's certain things that they want: value, inspiration, utility, delight, enablement. And that means that they may need to discover, they will want to transact with you, and then they also want a sense of belonging, right? And so that then plays itself out in a series of journeys. So that's the blue area. For those journeys, you need to rely on business platforms. That's in the gray. And then finally, you need some enterprise-wide services to, in Craig's words, to glue this all together. And so we found this to be a really effective model in a number of different ways. First of all, of course, it's customer-centric, and everything in our world should be customer-centric. It's also very journey-oriented. And it thinks in terms of enterprise services that may play out in different areas of your stack. One of the things that I really like about this is that it separates concerns, particularly between the blue and the gray. That maybe IT should own the gray, the actual platforms, but business should own the journeys, which is another way of saying that business should own the applications that run on these platforms, which is another way of saying that you really need to, on the business side, have product managers, right? You may have IT platform managers for the business platforms, but you need product managers to manage the products that are going to allow your customers to realize the journeys that they want. So this also implies a certain set of governance as well underneath this. So this is an enormously effective model. There's a number of different things that you can do with it in the end. One thing that we have, kind of messed around with a little bit is, doing different sorts of, stoplight analysis. What are we doing? Taking various surveys and doing other sort of self-assessments, including benchmarking, which we have some tools to help our subscribers do, around, hey, where are we doing well? Where are we not doing well? And this, again, is a single visual that allows us to then have a common conversation about where we need to go in terms of our stack. This particular company, was having issues. They were really good about transacting with their customers and giving them a sense of belonging. They were having trouble with some of their top line marketing. They realized that people were not discovering them and that they really needed to focus a lot more on outbound engagement, on customer experience management, and digital and media asset management as well. So what this also tells you too is we haven't mentioned any vendor names. And what we've been talking about is services, and that is so important, right? To be thinking first and foremost as you build your stack in terms of services. Yes, at some point you're going to have to plug in vendors, and at that point you don't want to just reach to fill a service with a vendor that you already have, and instead to really make sure, are we getting the right fit for the sort of capability that we're going to need? And even if you're a large company, there's times when you may need even more simpler tools than you're going to get out of the Salesforces and IBMs and Adobes and Oracles of this world. So again, here we want to be thinking initially about services and not vendors. We'll come back to vendors in a second because, of course, you can't live without them. Hopefully you can live with them. And we're going to talk about how to pick the right vendors. But right now, let's just think about services as we build our stack. And so what are some lessons that then we can draw on this? First, do understand your environment as a stack or at least a collection of technologies, right? And what we know that there's data suggesting that coming out of Chief MarTech and others, that every year the typical MarTech stack, both for mid-market and particularly large enterprises, is expanding. That what used to be 8 to 12 technologies is now more typically 16 to 24 or even 48 different tools across your MarTech stack. And so it's really critical initially just to do an inventory and understand how these pieces fit together. But some are going to be more critical than others. You're going to have certain pieces that are anchors in your mall and others that are really more, kind of boutiques. And both have a role to play, right? You just may need to treat them differently. But at the end of the day, what you really want is not so much to just be looking at yourself, but to be looking at the customer and have their needs drive your priorities in your organizational model. And if you're doing that, then you'd never want to default to a single vendor suite, because that's basically just assuming that your vendor knows what your customers want instead of you knowing what your customers want. The other thing is not to neglect your core, and this is really around customer data and identity management. Two really critical pieces. You have to separate those from your engagement systems. You have to literally deconstruct them from your engagement system and really have them reside at a lower level in your enterprise. That's the only way that you're going to be able to effectively plug in new technologies going forward. But you will be plugging in new technologies, and so that's why it's really important to make product selection a core institutional capability. And this is really critical because we know that historically half of all IT projects fail to meet their objectives. And so, there's various reasons for that, but very often problems really start at inception, where we get the wrong fitting tool. And so as our stacks grow and as we select more tools, we really have to get good at this. So how do you get good at building the right stack with new tools? And the way that, we've thought long and hard about this over the last 17 years, and we decided that really design thinking was the best approach to this. It's a kind of an anti-waterfall approach that really focuses on building the right team, testing this technology in a hand-on way, iterating through these tests so that you can learn more about your requirements, and then adapting the selection process based on what you learned. And we thought this was so important that my colleague Jared Gingras and I ended up writing a book that was published by Rosenfeld Media, The Right Way to Select Technology. If any of you are subscribers to our research and would like a copy of this book, feel free to reach out to my colleague Scott, and we will speed you one. If you don't, you can certainly find it on Amazon. It's a very quick read. And I'm going to just describe a little bit here what that methodology is and how it relates to MarTech. So just what is design thinking? Different people have different definitions of it. I particularly like this one from Stanford University professor David Kelly, that it's a human-centered approach, right, that draws on the designer's toolkit to integrate the needs of people, technology, and business, right? And so that's design thinking as a whole. And the 5 phases that he identifies for this are empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test, right? And so then how do we do this in the context of selecting technology? And so it really becomes kind of a filtration effort, where first you want to create stories. So instead of having these checklist-based RFPs, you have narrative RFPs. And it's been a really interesting journey for us over the last 17 years, helping our subscribers build these stories in a really effective way that allows them to test and discriminate among these tools. That then becomes the basis for your RFP. Of course, you want to create a short list of vendors. There's 8,000 MarTech vendors out there, and growing every year, according to Chief MarTech. And so you obviously have a lot of choices. And I'll come back to that short list in a second, because it can be difficult building that. Then you use the proposal and the demo process to really ideate and prototype, because you're never going to get your requirements right the first time around. So what you really do is create an iterative process where you're reviewing proposals, you're bringing vendors in for, and rather than the generic demo, they're actually demoing your stories. So then you have a chance to improve those stories based on what you learn, and filter the ones out that make less sense, and really focus on what are the key, whether they're employee journeys or customer journeys that you need to support. But then at the end of the day, one of the most critical things you'd have to do is to do a proof of concept, or POC, otherwise known as a bake-off. The difference between demos and a POC is that you're actually hands-on in the technology. You're actually impersonating the key personas in your stories and actually trying out the software. I'm dumbfounded at how many enterprises, including large enterprises that should know better, do not actually test the technology before they buy it. They're impressed by demos and long abstract conversations and checklists, and they go buy technology, and then they figure out whether it's going to work for them. Now, then that's the wrong way to do it. You definitely want a hands-on process. But if you're getting it hands-on, then you have to have a really good filtration process too. You obviously can't get hands-on with a lot of different tools. Ultimately, you want to get down to two. And so a lot of that is really around how do you build the right shortlist. So, we have an interesting tool that I invite you to try out. And I go back to where we began this webinar around this whole notion of quadrants. Quadrants are useful if they're real. Right? You don't want a magic quadrant. You don't want some mythical wave. You want a real quadrant, something that really aligns to your specific needs. So we have a tool on our website you can check out called Real Quadrant. It's a shortlist generator. And here's an example. It's for an enterprise portals, which we still see in, for example, in financial services for customer extranets. And two different use cases. On the left, it's internal collaboration, and I'm very concerned about cost. And so we have a couple of vendors that appear in the upper right. On the left, I'm looking more for BIs and dashboards, business intelligence, and I really want to make sure it's going to be a complex build, that I've got strong professional services partners who can help me. And you'll see that the winner vendors have completely switched here, which is another way of saying that there's no generic winners and losers in this technology marketplace. There are those that are going to be good fit for you relative to your stories and your strategic considerations. And so that's exactly what we allow you to modify and generate your own real quadrant in contrast to a magic quadrant. So let's wrap things up here. In terms of selecting technologies, you want to adopt an iterative approach. Right? That's the key thing, is you're iterating. Your stories are not going to be perfect at the beginning, but they're going to be pretty darn good when you're in test mode at the end, hands-on test mode. So you have light requirements, refine them over time, and then you're testing them at every step of the process. And that's how you adopt new and replacement tools into your new and improved MarTech stack. Here's some of the research that we publish. These are the hardest hitting vendor evaluations you'll see in the marketplace. And very excited again next month to be adding customer data platforms, or CDPs, to this list of what will be 5 streams. That's my contact information at the top if you want to stay in touch. I encourage you to go to realstorygroup.com/try to get a free samples of some of these vendor evaluations, and just to see how our methodology works. So in terms of, and the other thing that I want to do is invite you, some questions have come in. If you have any other questions or any concerns or anything you disagree with, feel free to use your GoToWebinar control panel and ask that question right now while Scott talks about next steps.
Great, thanks, Tony. And as Tony mentioned, we certainly encourage you to go on our site, download a sample of the research. You can also actually try out the tools that are included with the research subscription, such as the Real Quadrant application that Tony showed. And and give a try to the real-time vendor comparison tool and the real score benchmarking application as well. If you'd like to see a more interactive, hands-on demonstration, just drop us a line at explore@realstorygroup.com, and we can schedule 20 to 30 minutes to walk you through the site, learn more about your digital technology strategy, and discuss potential ways we can be a resource for you moving forward. Certainly, again, encourage you to also give us a call with any questions, and it does look like a few have come into the queue that I'll turn the mic back over to Tony to take a look at.
Great. So Jonathan's asking, can you share a generic B2B diagram? So you recall that the two initial stacks that I showed were both kind of B2C examples, and that's certainly true. What I can do is, if you want to just contact me offline, Jonathan, I can certainly show you some others. If your company is a subscriber to our research, then you definitely have access to white papers that go into this in more detail. Tamara has a question about some of the conclusions that we came to here, particularly number 5. How do you do this when everything is so incredibly stuck together and muddy? That's a great question, because the issue, Tamara, as you are kind of hinting at here, is that we've all done this in a vertically integrated way, which turned out to be not the right way to do it, although we didn't have any choice, which is that we ended up having a lot of customer data and identity management and personalization rules jammed into our digital asset management platforms, jammed into our WCM platforms, really jammed into our marketing automation platforms, which try to imagine themselves as grand orchestrators, but they're not. They're really good about sending out emails, right? So the way that you do this is I think twofold. One is you really think very hard about a future to-be architecture, and then select the right underlying platforms, and that's clearly an area where we can help you. But then the second thing is to come up with a really strong program plan that says, hey, I'm going to disconnect certain capabilities from my front-end systems in an orderly way, which is, you can't do it all at once, but over time, maybe I'm going to remove the personalization rules from my WCM platform. I'm going to remove the customer data layer from my CRM platform, from my marketing automation platform. This is, to be sure, going to be a multi-quarter, if not multi-year effort. And in some cases, you will discover that your engagement vendors don't allow you to have this kind of decoupled architecture. And those are tools and vendors that you want to leave, because they are holding you hostage. So again, if your company is a subscriber to our research, happy to get on have a deeper conversation and have another call. We have another question from Paula, who's asking, where is Microsoft in all this? That's a great question. Microsoft is on our map. They kind of have a WCM play in SharePoint on-prem, although you wouldn't use it for anything customer-facing, I would argue. They definitely have a strong CRM capability. They have removed some of their digital marketing capabilities from that, and appear to be aligning increasingly with Adobe, which I think is a bad move for Microsoft customers. I think that Redmond is kind of retooling here, and I would hope that they come up with some of their own, particularly some of their own marketing automation and email engagement capabilities. Ideally, as part of the broader stack of services, complementary services available in Azure. We'll see where Microsoft goes. Historically, I believe Microsoft has been much stronger at digital workplace-facing technologies than customer-facing technologies. It's just an anomaly of that organization. And one could argue, actually, that there's similar issues with Salesforce as well. So that's where Microsoft is, or another way of putting it, that's where Microsoft isn't. So thanks very much for all of your questions. Feel free again to reach out, to me or Scott directly by email, or call Scott. We can set up a consultation if your firm is a subscriber. And it's been wonderful spending a half hour with you. Keep an eye out for future webinars, and let's stay in touch. For Tony Byrne, for Real Story Group, this is Tony Byrne signing off. Bye now.